So we're still working with the lists class, and what we're going to do now is we're going to use a slightly different method which is worth looking at and worth knowing about. And we're going to do a method called list of string, so that's what it's returning, and we'll call it character codes. So this is all of the character codes in the first column of our data file. This is all of those codes right the way down through the whole of the list. Right, so here we go. So we get the path again, so remembering that this is a thing that you must modify if you're not using E drives, which I'm sure you're not. So that's pretty good to know. Usually you'll just change that to C. Right, so we've got a list of codes, which are actually strings. Here's a new list of strings, and we're calling it codes. And here we are. Here's the new thing, the using statement. Now, the using statement is a technique to make sure that when it's done what it needs to do, it clears everything it was using out of RAM. And it's as simple as that. And it's really good for memory management. And the using statement says that while I'm using it, I'll keep it in RAM, but the minute I've stopped using it, I'll find all of the RAM that I used and clear it out. So we do exactly the same for. We do the while statement, so while it's true, that means that while we've got something to read, we're going to read through the line using our reader, same as we did before. And if the line is null, we drop, we just break, because we can't use a null line, and it also indicates the end of the file too. And then we're going to split by using our comma, get a character to hold our data, and we're going to read column 1 just as the code into the class or the object that we've called character. Now, we've got 2 available fields, and this proves to you that you don't actually have to use every field of an object every time you call that object. You can actually just populate the code. And there are some ways of making a field or an attribute mandatory, but here it's not. So we add the character and we get our list. And our list is called codes, and we return it. So that's pretty straightforward, I hope. Let's finish off our lists class by doing the final function or method that we're going to call. And this is where we look for something and check whether we can find it in a particular list. And we're going to search a list of strings, and we're going to have a string to find in that list. So it's really quite tricky technique. Well, it's not tricky, it's a nice technique, in fact. So we're going to use a bool to track whether we find or not, and then for each value in the list to search. Right, so here's the for each statement, which is useful. For each what? String, we're going to call it value, in list to search that we give it. Yeah. If it's identical to the one that we wanted to find, string found is true, return string found. This is quite a neat technique to use. So we're looking in a list, we have a target to find, and we check whether when we get to each item in the list, if it equals the value we're trying to find. And if it does, we'd return string found. And that will stop when it finds. It says return string found inside the if. So if it returns the function will stop. So that's a really quite a nice little technique. And what we'll do next is we'll move on to the validator class and see how much of that we can get done in this video. So I've created the new class called Utility Validator. I've given my directives that I think I'm going to use. The only one I added really was system.data. I've put the module header in, and I've made the class public as usual. Before we can use this class though, there's a class on which this class will depend called Invalid Character, and we haven't created that yet, so I'm just going to create that. And this is just a data class, and we're going to add 2 fields in there, but I'm not going to use the prop full system. They don't have to be prop full. I'm just going to make them as simple props, and that's the format as you'll remember for that. Public string character, and you put the get and set inside the curly braces, and you've got that property then created. So that's what we've got next. So we can now start to use that class when we use our code inside Utility Validator. So I'm going to paste the code into Utility Validator, and then we'll look at it method by method. So I've pasted this code in, and there's a lot of it. Now this is the real meat and gravy of this application. This is where you put your business rules in. This is where you make sure that before you start to use anything, the thing you want to use is going to be ready for you, so that you don't have to suddenly start to change your train of thought and rebuild things. And I'm going to go through these, as I said, as one at a time, just to explain them to you. We use them at various stages in the application, and you know that when we come to call it, it's all going to be there for us to use. So I'm just collapsing everything at the moment just so that it doesn't distract us. So the first method is, excuse me, I'm going to get a static variable which we're going to be able to call when we need, and that's the length rule. And do you remember our globals class where we had our length rule? And at the moment it's showing 8. Now that could change, and in fact this is not really good practice, is it? Because you would look that up. You'd say don't store it, yes, let's look at it, look for it and use it. But here we are, we've got it as a literal value, as we call that. That's a hard-coded value, and we're going to call it when we need it. Right, so we've got our variable available that's going to return 8. So we say if the length of the string, this is going to be the password or the generated item, which has got to be 8 or more, is greater than or equal to the minimum rule, return true. So that's all that's happening there. So that's pretty straightforward there. So the next one, are the characters all valid? So what we're going to do here is we're going to check whether they're all valid, and allowing us to call the function we created already for lists, the valid character codes, and use that to check whether everything in our string, by looping through every character in our string, and check where it's in that list of valid characters. Because if it's not, we can return false and tell the user, oi, there's an invalid character in this string that you want to try and use. So there's this one here, which is get invalid character. So if we get this, and we're doing exactly the same thing as before, the invalid character, as you remember, is they've got those 2 fields. Checking array. Length check first, then go through each one. If we find string found from lists, invalid character gets the data that we find. So this is just another way of getting invalid characters instead of valid characters. So we had a list of valid characters. We may also want to have a list of invalid characters, so we can check that above, and if it's in here it's not valid. Really easy to return the invalid characters. So this video is running to 8 minutes, so I'm going to stop here and we'll finish off in the next video where we'll add the last 3 methods, or sorry, discuss the last 3 methods. I've added them, and you'll get the code file obviously for using it yourselves.